2 years, 3 months, and 11 days since I signed those papers. Not that I was counting. Okay, I was counting. You count things when they cost you everything. I'd left the kind of life most women dreamed about. A house with actual gates. A kitchen bigger than my entire childhood apartment. A husband who could make a phone call and solve any problem except the one standing right in front of him. I'd left all of it on a Tuesday morning in February, with 2 suitcases and a secret I hadn't figured out how to carry yet. My daughter was 18 months old now. She had his eyes, dark, almost black, the kind that looked like they were always calculating something. I used to tease him about that, told him he was born suspicious. He never laughed. He just looked at me with those eyes and said, "Suspicion keeps people alive in my world." I should have listened harder to that sentence. His name was Rowan Steele. And no, I'm not being dramatic when I tell you that that name fit him perfectly. Cold, structural, immovable. He'd built his empire from the ground up, starting with commercial real estate in Chicago before expanding into private security, contracting, infrastructure, things I didn't ask too many questions about. By the time I met him, he was the kind of man who walked into a room and everyone else unconsciously straightened their posture. I was 26. I was doing freelance interior design, barely keeping my head above water, and I'd been hired to redesign the lobby of one of his downtown properties. He came to the walkthrough himself, which apparently he never did. His assistant kept apologizing for his presence like it was an inconvenience. I kept thinking it was strange that someone would apologize for their own boss showing up. He shook my hand and said, "You're younger than I expected." I said, "You're more here than I expected." He blinked. Then, slowly, like it took a moment to load, he smiled. That was it. That was the entire beginning of us. We dated for 8 months and got married on a Saturday in October at a venue I'd helped design myself. My mother cried. My best friend? She'd been my roommate since college, the one person who always told me the truth. She toasted us at the reception and said, "I hope he knows what he's got." The way she looked at him when she said it was less congratulations and more warning. She saw it before I did. She always did. The first year was good. Not perfect, but good. He traveled constantly. He kept parts of his life partitioned off from me, the way you'd keep certain files password protected on a shared computer. I told myself it was the nature of his work. He told me it was for my protection. I accepted that because the alternative, that he simply didn't trust me enough to let me in, was too painful to sit with. The second year was when I started understanding what the partitions were actually protecting. He had a way of handling problems that I can only describe as efficient, not cruel, necessarily. Just clean. People who created issues in his professional life had a way of quietly ceasing to be relevant. Deals that went sideways had a way of correcting themselves. I asked him once, after a dinner where I'd watched him have a 40-second phone call that seemed to resolve something that had been a crisis 20 minutes earlier. I asked him what he'd said. He looked at me the way you look at a child asking how a car engine works. Not dismissively. Just, "This isn't for you. You don't need to know that," he said. That's the whole point. I started to understand then that I would always be on the outside of something. Not because I wasn't loved. I believe, in whatever way he was capable of it, that he loved me. But in his world, love and access were different things. He loved me and still kept me at exactly the distance he calculated was safe. When I told him I wanted a baby, he went quiet for a long time. We were in bed on a Thursday night. He'd actually been home, which had become less common, and I'd said it carefully, like I was approaching something skittish. I've been thinking about starting a family. He didn't turn over. He didn't look at me. He stared at the ceiling and said, "I can't have a child in my life right now. You know what I do." "You know what that means," I said. "I know what you do. I also know other men in your position who have families," he said. "Those men have made different choices than I have. Or that they haven't fully understood." I didn't say anything after that. I just lay there in the dark, and something shifted inside me that I never fully felt shift back. 3 months later, I found out I was pregnant. I want to be clear. I didn't plan it. I also didn't not plan it, which I've spent a lot of time being honest with myself about. I was 31 years old, I loved my husband, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I believed a baby would open a door in him that I hadn't found yet. That's not a good reason to bring a child into the world. I know that now. I told myself I'd tell him when the time was right. The time was never right. He went to London for 6 weeks on something I wasn't allowed to ask about. When he came back, I was 14 weeks along and barely showing, and he seemed distracted in a way that made me feel even more invisible than usual. I kept finding reasons to wait. Another week, another trip, another night where he came home late and exhausted, and I convinced myself this wasn't the moment. At 18 weeks, I miscarried a few nights of sleep and gained them back in anxiety. I found an email I wasn't supposed to see. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that too. I'd been using his laptop to print something because mine had died, and a browser tab was already open, and the name in the email was one I recognized. A woman who handled logistics for one of his projects, someone I'd met twice at company events. The email wasn't romantic. It was something worse. It was operational. It referenced decisions that had been made. It referenced outcomes. I didn't finish reading it. I closed the laptop and sat on the edge of our bed for 45 minutes. Then I tacked 2 suitcases. I left a note that said, "I love you. I can't do this. Please don't look for me." He didn't look for me. I've never decided how to feel about that. My friend took me in without a single question. She just opened her apartment door, looked at my suitcases, and said, "Okay, come in." I didn't tell her about the baby for 2 more weeks. When I did, she sat across from me at her kitchen table and said, "Does he know?" I said no. She said, "Are you going to tell him?" I said I didn't know. She said that's not an answer. She was right. But it was all I had. The divorce was handled through lawyers. His were expensive and efficient. Mine was a woman named Patricia Ellison's, who came recommended, and turned out to be quietly formidable. The settlement was generous in a way that felt less like generosity, and more like a man tidying a loose end. I took enough to be stable, and not $1 more than that. I didn't want his money. I wanted to be able to look at my daughter someday and tell her that her mother made it on her own. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park. I went back to freelance design. My neighbor, a retired kindergarten teacher named Dottie, became the kind of person you don't realize you're leaning on until you're already leaning. She watched the baby on the mornings I had client calls. She brought over soup when I hadn't slept. She asked nothing about my ex-husband except, once, "Was he good to you?" And when I took too long to answer, she nodded like I'd said everything. My daughter's name was Ivy. No, wait, I should say, her name is Ivy. She is present tense and she deserves present tense. Ivy was a loud baby who became a loud toddler. She had opinions about everything. She had a specific way she needed her toast cut. She had a stuffed rabbit named Button who had to sleep inside her left arm, or she would not sleep at all. She had those dark eyes that tracked everything and processed it in private. And I'd catch myself watching her sometimes, trying to figure out who she was becoming. How much of him was in there? All of it, I think. And somehow it didn't break me the way I expected it to. She was 18 months old on the night everything changed. It was a Sunday in November. Cold enough that I'd already put the extra blanket on her crib. She'd seemed a little off at dinner, not finishing her food, which was unusual, clingy in a way that made me carry her around the kitchen while I cleaned up one-handed. I put her down at 7:30, and she didn't fight it, which should have told me something. Ivy always fought bedtime. At 9:45, I heard her on the monitor. Not crying exactly, more like whimpering, a kind of continuous low sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. I went in and found her flushed, hot to the touch, curled on her side, gripping Button with both hands. I took her temperature, 104.2. I called the pediatric nurse line. They asked me to describe her symptoms. I did. There was a pause, and then the nurse said, calmly, "I'd like you to take her to the ER. That kind of calm is the most frightening kind." I called my friend, but she didn't pick up. It was late. She worked early. I called Dottie, who said she'd come sit at my apartment in case I needed anything, which was exactly the right thing to say. I bundled Ivy into her car seat and drove to Northwestern Memorial. In the ER, they took her back quickly, which in a hospital either means it's not serious or it is. A nurse named someone I didn't catch took Ivy's vitals and started asking questions. Medical history, allergies, developmental milestones. She had a clipboard and a calm, efficient energy that I was trying to borrow. Then, she asked, "Is the father in the picture?" I said, We're divorced, she said. Okay. Do you have access to his medical history? I said I didn't understand why that would be relevant. She said, there's a pattern here we want to rule out. Some of what we're seeing can have a hereditary component. It would help to know if he has any history of immune disorders, cardiac arrhythmia, anything passed down from his side. I sat there with my coat still on, and my daughter in a hospital gown that was 3 sizes too big for her, and I thought, I don't know his medical history. We had been married for almost 2 years. I had slept next to this man, eaten dinner with him, rearranged my entire life around his, and I could not tell a doctor one concrete thing about his family's health because it was information that lived behind one of his partitions. The nurse gave me a look that was kind but waiting. I said, I'm going to have to call him. I hadn't spoken to Rowan in over 2 years. His contact was still in my phone, which I'd told myself was practical, not sentimental. It was 11:47 p.m. I stepped into the hallway outside Ivy's room, and I stood there for probably 2 full minutes just holding my phone. Then I called. It rang twice. Yes, that was how he answered. Not hello, not who is this, just yes, like he'd been waiting for a question and I was finally asking it. I said it's me. Then I stopped because I didn't know what came next. A pause. Not long. Then, I know, I said, I'm at Northwestern, at the ER. My voice did something I didn't plan for. I cleared my throat. There's a situation and the doctor needs your medical history. Family history of immune disorders or cardiac arrhythmia specifically. Silence. I said, I know this is, he said. Which hospital did you say? Northwestern Memorial. I'll be there in 20 minutes. You don't need to. The call ended. I stood in the fluorescent hallway and stared at my phone and tried to figure out what had just happened. I'd called for information. I had not called for him to come. Those were supposed to be 2 different things. He was there in 18 minutes. I know because I checked. He came through the ER doors in a charcoal overcoat. No tie, the kind of put together that meant he'd been awake and working, not sleeping. He saw me before I saw him and crossed the waiting room in a way that cleared space around him without effort. He stopped in front of me. His eyes went to my face first, then down the hallway toward Ivy's room. He said, What room? I said. You can't just what room, I told him. I don't know what I expected from him in that room. Something controlled. Something like the man who'd ended phone calls mid-crisis and gone back to dinner without visible distress. What I got was Rowan Steele standing at the foot of a hospital crib, looking down at an 18-month-old girl with his own eyes and going completely still. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, She's mine. It wasn't a question. I said, yes. He looked at me then. There was something in his face I hadn't seen before. Or maybe I had, once, a long time ago, before he'd gotten practiced at removing it. He said, You didn't tell me. I said, You told me you couldn't have a child in your life. Those were your exact words. He said, That's not. He stopped. He looked back at Ivy. That's not what that meant. I said, What did it mean? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the nurse who'd followed him in. She'd been remarkably non-interventional. I'll give her that. And he said, I'm the father. What do you need to know? He gave them the medical history. Thoroughly, specifically, with a level of detail that suggested he had memorized his own body, the same way he memorized everything else. His grandfather on his father's side had a documented history of an immune condition. His own childhood records showed an early episode of cardiac irregularity that had self-resolved. He provided everything they needed in about 4 minutes. The doctors ran more tests. They told us to wait. We sat in a small waiting area outside Ivy's room. 2 chairs, a low table with a plastic plant, the kind of fluorescent quiet that exists only in hospitals after midnight. Rowan sat with his forearms on his knees, looking at the floor. I sat with my coat still on and my hands folded. He said, How long? I said, She'll be 2 in April. He processed that. I could see him doing it, running the math, checking it against a calendar he kept internally. He said, You left before you knew. I said, I left before I told you. I knew for 3 months before I left. He looked at me. I said, I know. I know what that sounds like. I've had a long time to figure out exactly what it sounds like, and I don't have a clean answer. I was scared. I thought you'd see it as me trying to change your mind about something you'd already decided. I stopped. I thought you'd find a way to manage it, like you manage everything. And I didn't want our daughter to be something that got managed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that what you think I do? Manage things?" I said, "Isn't it?" He said, "I kept you safe for 2 years." I said, "I know." He said, "You don't know the specifics of what that involved." I said, "I know. That was always the problem." We sat there. The plastic plant didn't move. The hallway hummed its fluorescent hum. He said, "I have a daughter." Not a question. Not to me exactly. More like someone saying a thing out loud to make it real. I said, "Her name is Ivy. She likes toast cut in triangles. She sleeps with a stuffed rabbit. She has about 40 words, but she's very strategic about which ones she uses in front of people she doesn't trust yet." Something crossed his face, almost like pain, except softer. He said, "She sounds like me." I said, "She is like you." We didn't speak again for a while. The doctor came out around 2 in the morning with news that was serious but manageable. A viral infection with some secondary inflammation. The hereditary information had helped them target the treatment. She'd need to stay for observation and IV fluids. She was going to be okay. I felt something unknit in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tied since I'd taken her temperature. Rowan exhaled. It was the most human sound I'd heard from him in years. He said, "Can I see her?" I said, "She's sleeping." He said, "I know. I just want to see her." I walked him back to her room. Ivy was asleep on her back, Button tucked under her left arm exactly where she needed him. The Ivy a small intrusion she'd somehow slept through. Her cheeks were still flushed, but her breathing was even. Rowan stood at the side of the crib and looked at her for a long time. I stayed in the doorway. I don't know what he was thinking. For once, I didn't try to figure it out. Eventually, he said, without turning around, "I'm not going to pretend the last 2 years didn't happen. I'm also not going to pretend I understand everything you did or that I'm not." He paused. "There are things I need to say that I don't know how to say standing in a hospital at 2 in the morning. I said, "Okay," he said. "But I need you to know something, right now, tonight. I need you to know that whatever you think I meant when I said I couldn't have a child in my life." He turned then and looked at me. I meant I was afraid. I meant I didn't know if I was capable of being the kind of father a child deserves. I meant I had never once in my life let someone be that close to me without building something around them to keep them safe, and I didn't know how you do that with a child. You can't just... He stopped. "You can't just build walls around a child." I looked at him. I said, "No, you can't." He said, "I've spent 2 years building walls around people I've already lost." The fluorescent light hummed. Ivy breathed. Button stayed tucked under her left arm. I said, "She's going to want to know who you are," he said. "I know," I said. "She doesn't understand complicated yet. She understands person who shows up, person who reads stories, person who cuts toast in triangles," he said. "I can learn triangles." I almost smiled. I didn't mean to. It came from somewhere underneath the last 2 years, some pocket of the person I'd been before I understood what I was walking into. I said, "This doesn't fix everything," he said. "I know," I said. "There's a lot we'd have to figure out, separate from whatever we are or aren't to each other. She comes first in all of it," he said. "She should have come first a long time ago. That's on me." I stood there and looked at this man who had kept pieces of himself locked in, rooms I never had keys to, and I thought about the 2 years I'd spent building something small and stable and mine. I thought about Ivy's toast and Button and Dottie bringing soup. I thought about what it had cost me and what I'd managed to build with the cost. I said, "The doctors said she'll probably sleep until morning." He said, "I'll stay." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "I know." He got a chair from the hallway and brought it into her room and sat down beside the crib. I took the chair on the other side. The nurse came in quietly at 4, checked Ivy's vitals, gave us a small nod. At some point I fell asleep. I know because I woke up to the gray early light coming through the hospital blinds, and Rowan was still there, awake, watching Ivy sleep. She woke up at 6:15. She blinked. She looked at me. She looked at the IV, which she did not appreciate. Then she looked at him. She studied him for a long moment with those dark eyes that missed nothing. Then she reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his overcoat. He went very still. She said, "Hi." He said, "Hi." She said, "Button," and held up the rabbit. He looked at the rabbit. He looked at her. He said very carefully, "Hi, Button." She seemed satisfied with this. She tucked Button back under her arm and looked around the room for her next order of business. Rowan looked at me over the top of her crib. There was something in his face I recognized, finally, from a very long time ago. That first walkthrough, that slow, loaded moment before the smile, he said, "You named her Ivy." I said, "I did." He said, "Ivy Steele." I said, "Her last name is currently mine." He said, "I know." A pause. I'm just saying it. To hear it. I looked at my daughter, who had moved on entirely from both of us, and was now attempting to remove her hospital bracelet. I thought about walls and triangles and what it means to let someone close enough to need you. I thought about the 2 years I'd spent, being certain I'd made the right call, and this moment that made certainty feel suddenly less important than whatever came next. I said, "We're going to figure this out slowly. In the right order." He said, "Yes." I said, "She has a doctor's appointment on Thursday." He said, "I'll be there." I looked at him. He said, "If that's okay," I said. "Ask me closer to Thursday." He nodded. He looked back at Ivy, who had given up on the bracelet and was now watching him again, with that steady, assessing, ancient-seeming gaze. She pointed at him and said, with great confidence, "Man," he said, "that's right." She considered this. Then she reached for his sleeve again, made a small sound of decision, and went back to examining Button. He didn't move for a long time. Later, after the doctors came and said she was responding well, and we'd likely be home by evening. After, my friend showed up with coffee and looked at Rowan, and then at me with an expression I promised myself I'd address in full at a later date. After Dottie texted to ask how we were, and I sent back, "Okay, actually," and meant it. Rowan was standing in the hallway pulling on his coat, getting ready to go handle whatever it was that he always had to handle, when he stopped and turned back. He said, "I was wrong to say what I said that night. In bed, about not wanting." He stopped. "I was wrong," I said. "I know." He said, "I don't know how to be what she needs. I want you to know I'm aware of that." I said, "Nobody knows how to be what they need at first. You figure it out in triangles." He looked at me. I said, "Small pieces, one at a time." He said, "Okay." He left. The door closed behind him. My friend looked at me and said, "Okay, what was that?" I said, "I genuinely don't know yet." She said, "Are you okay?" I looked back through the window at Ivy, who had finally fallen back asleep with Button tucked exactly where he needed to be. A small, warm person in a too big hospital gown. My daughter, absolutely fine. I said, "Yeah, I actually am."